Thank you for coming. I'm Sue Bruns. I'm a volunteer here at the History Center. And Terry Smith, our guest today, happens to be a lake neighbor of mine. And I feel very privileged because I got a sneak peek at Code 4 a couple of years ago at the first couple of chapters. He happened to stop me on the road one day and said, well, you're a writer. I'm working on this thing. I'm trying to write about my experiences. That's the bell. I guess that means it's time. I'm going to close the door in case it rings again. And he said he was writing up some stories so that his grandkids would know what he did when he was a police officer and a law enforcement man, undercover drug agent, and the director of the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension here in northern Minnesota. So I gladly accepted his offer, read a couple of things, and said, yeah, I think you probably have a bigger audience than just your grandkids. I think there are a lot of people who would find this interesting. So I was really glad when he did decide to publish it as a book. And without further ado, Terry Smith.
All right, thank you. A lot of Saturday afternoons, I would think you might have something better to do, but looking out the window today, maybe this is as good as it gets, huh? As I was driving here, I saw one really strange guy sitting in a boat out on Lake Bemidji, and I thought I'd much rather give a talk at the History Center this afternoon, much as I like to fish. You know you're getting old when you write a book about your life and they think it belongs in the History Center. In 1965, I walked into a big high school gymnasium. I was there because I heard that the Bloomington Police Department was hiring, and this is the way to try to get on the department. I didn't grow up wanting to be a cop. It just seemed like that might be a good job, sounded interesting. When I walked into the room and saw hundreds of men, no women, because of course in those days we knew that women could not be police officers. We've since learned differently. But I almost turned and walked out because I thought, there's no way they're going to hire 4 or 5 guys out of this bunch. There's no way they're going to hire me. But I thought, well, I took the trouble to come here, so I'll stick with it and go through the motions anyway. And a couple of months later, to my astonishment, they offered me a job, and I started out on the Bloomington Police Department as a uniformed cop. Bloomington, as you probably know, is a southern suburb of Minneapolis. And it was quite an education for me because I couldn't really have told you what a job description for a police officer was. I knew the basics. I knew, of course, that you wrote speeding tickets, and I knew that you arrested people who needed to be arrested, a few things like that. But there was so much more involved in the job that I had no idea about. And it was really educational for me. And it wasn't very long on the job before I was telling myself, I really like this. And in a few minutes, I'll tell you what I liked about it or why it fit me. But just a quick sketch of my career. I did about 5 years as a uniformed officer. And then that brings us up to about 1970. And some of you are old enough to remember what was going on in 1970. That was the height of the anti-Vietnam War protest drug culture, and it seemed like narcotics were just coming in like a wave, and a lot of police departments were trying to do something about it. And so in the Twin Cities, they formed the Metro Area Narcotics Squad, and I and two other Bloomington cops were chosen to be on that squad. And so I went from being a straight-laced, high and tight haircut to being a guy with hair down to his shoulders and a big bushy beard, and wearing the uniform of the day, which was flowered shirts and bell-bottom jeans and so forth. And I began to work undercover in a world that was entirely different from anything I'd ever experienced before. Then in 1973, I went to work for the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, which is the detective division of the state police here in Minnesota. And I went into the organized crime unit, and I worked for some years as an organized crime investigator. I did some undercover work because somehow they figured I could do it. And then in 1986, I became a homicide investigator. And late in 1986, my boss came into my office one day and said, "I want to talk to you." He said, "I'd like to promote you to special agent in charge rank and send you to Bemidji, Minnesota." And I had to think about that for about 15 seconds and said, "Yeah, that sounds like a good idea." My wife, Liz, who's sitting up front here, had to think about it a little bit longer than that. But I grew up in Duluth and then went to high school in Grand Rapids, so in my heart I was always a northern Minnesotan. And I was so glad to get up here. My intention is to stay here until my kids make me go someplace else. And the job up here was somewhat different from what I had done anyplace else before, because now I was supervising 20-some agents and also an office staff. And we were primarily investigating homicides and then working major drug cases. And you'd be surprised to hear some of the numbers involved. During my 17 years here, we investigated about 450 death investigations out of this office. We don't usually think of that being something that happens in these small communities in northern Minnesota, but when you have one here and two there and one over there and three over there, after a while they add up. And so I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that. And I would really like to tell you anything you'd like to hear about law enforcement or what I did. I've got a few ideas of what I might talk about, but I would welcome you at any point to interrupt me and say, "I'd really like to ask you about this," or redirect what I'm talking about. But I've got kind of a chart to follow here anyway, so I'll start out in that direction and we'll see where we get. I probably wrote the stories that go into my book for 4 or 5 years before I had any idea I was writing a book. As Sue said, I was mostly writing them for my grandkids, and then it began to dawn on me that maybe other people might be interested. A couple of my grandkids are in the military. One's on an aircraft carrier and the other one's in the Marines. And I found out every time I would send them a story, the guy in the Navy would spread it around to all the guys on the aircraft carrier, who I wish now I had not given them free access to my stories so they'd all buy my book. But anyway, it was so interesting to find out that on the Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier, there were many people who were waiting for the next story from Chris's grandpa. And then in the Marine barracks, same thing was going on. So I began to think, well, maybe there are people who would be interested other than just my grandkids. So I set out to do one thing that was very important to me. I wanted to make sure if I was going to write a story that it was true and accurate. And you know that memory doesn't always serve us real well, even though I've always had a really good memory. But I had a couple of resources to help me with that. One was that I've got a stack of scrapbooks at home, because early on in my career it just made sense that anytime there was a write-up in the paper about some case I had worked or something that I had done, it was kind of fun to cut it out and stick it in the scrapbook. And in fact, the cover of the book that I did here is all just stuff that I pulled out of my scrapbook and sent to the people that were doing the cover for me. The other resource that I had was the people I worked with. And so every time I would write an account of something, I would send it to some of the people that were involved and basically say, is this the way you remember it? Did I get anything wrong? And so I'm telling you that the things that you read in this book are as true as I can possibly make them. I didn't try to make myself look any better than I should have, or anybody else look any worse than they should have. I was just trying to tell people what law enforcement used to be like and what it's like now, and tell some interesting stories. So why did I find the job so fulfilling? Well, there's a few things about it that I would say contributed to that. One is I love the excitement. Now, when I was going to school, they weren't talking about ADD in those days. But knowing what it is now and thinking back, I think, well, let's see, I was one of those kids that was always looking out the window, and maybe just the idea of being on the edge and not knowing what's coming next, and thriving on the excitement of the job, maybe that's part of what made it so fun for me. Another thing is I just really like people, and I like to help people. So that gets me in trouble sometimes, because my friends often will ask me to help shingle a roof or something like that. And I always do it, and I always hope it's the last time I ever do it. But that's kind of my instinct. And I found, when I was in a squad car, I found that so much of what we were called to do was just simply helping people. We were rescuing people who need to be rescued, but not always as dramatic as that. I changed a few flat tires for people as I was driving around in my squad car, and I saw perhaps a lady who was looking very distressed and standing beside her open trunk and trying to figure out what comes next. And so I would roll up and say, "Ma'am, you look like you need help." I found that very, very satisfying. And investigating homicides, you would think would be a terrible thing to do, and it is in many ways. But on the other hand, it's such an important thing to do that feeling like you're doing something that really matters is very fulfilling. Another question that people might ask is, why are cops willing to take the risks that they do? When something terrible happens, something dangerous happens, most people's instinct is to turn and get away from there as fast as they can. But a cop's job is to go the other direction. And you might very well wonder, why are cops willing to do that? I can only answer for myself, of course. Probably one of the reasons that I was willing to do that was a lack of imagination or crazy optimism on my part. You know, I did all kinds of high-risk entries, and going through what in law enforcement they call the fatal funnel, which is going into a doorway. They always told us in SWAT team training, if you're ever going to get shot, that's probably where it's going to happen. And in fact, 2 people that I worked with did get shot. One was a Minneapolis officer who was badly wounded but survived. Another was a Duluth officer who was killed going into a doorway. But I never could imagine that that was going to happen to me. It was just one of those things where I knew it was dangerous. I knew this was a big risk, but I just somehow thought, I'm going to survive this. And as you can see, I did, so I was right, see? You have an internal conversation with yourself as a police officer. It's something you need to do early on, and that is you have to ask yourself, am I willing to do what this job requires? Am I willing, let's say that suddenly you get a call that there's a shooting incident in the school and everybody is running out the door. Well, your job is to run into the school and find out what's going on and stop it. Are you willing to do that? And you have to ask yourself that question, and the answer has to be yes. Even if I die, I'm going to go in through that door and I'm going to deal with whatever it is that's happening there. There's also kind of a sacred trust between police officers, where if one is facing danger, you won't let him or her face danger alone. And that's part of the whole thing that you have to figure out in advance, or else you need to go find another job. And I will tell you, sometimes I scare myself now when I go back and I think of some of the risks that I took and some of the things that could have happened, because I have really enjoyed my life. My life could have ended at age 22 or 25 or 30 or 40, but it didn't, of course. But I think of that and I think I must have been crazy to take some of the risks that I did. But it made sense at the time. So what does a police job do to people? Well, you can answer that yourself, I think, if I lay it out for you. The police job largely involves dealing with people who are at their worst. You are going to places that your parents told you to stay away from and dealing with people who are often not doing very well. And you're going to the lowest dives in town, don't have many calls at a church or something like that. Usually it's a place where a lot of bad things are happening. And you're dealing with a lot of tragedy. So imagine having to deal day after day with people who are angry, for instance. You know, probably in your life you've had some kind of interaction with somebody who's been angry about something, and most of us don't enjoy that very much. It's not pleasant. But imagine if that's pretty much what your life was, your working life, day after day, dealing with people who were upset. Maybe they're mad at you or somebody else. And then beyond that, interacting with people who not only are angry, but they're acting out their anger. And it's your job to stop that. Maybe that involves physical force. Maybe it just simply involves getting real stern with them. But that's part of your daily activity. So what would that do to you? It did the same thing to me. It makes you kind of tougher than you used to be. I mean, it's not that you can't speak pleasantly with people or that you can't be a nice person, but it also puts you in a mindset where if somebody needs to be dealt with, you're pretty ready to deal with them. And then there are some other things that can kind of eat away at you. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of trying to help somebody who was badly injured. You know, maybe you came across a car accident and you were one of the first people there and you tried to help out before somebody else could get there to help. That's pretty traumatic. It's emotional. It takes a bit of a toll on you. But imagine if you did that several times a day or several times a week. And you did that week after week. And you not only saw some pretty gruesome things, but you dealt with people who were either terribly traumatized or gravely injured, or the most difficult thing for me was seeing small children who were hurt or terrified or dead. I've never done anything more difficult than hold a dead child in my hands. But that's part of the job. So what does it do to you? It does to us the same thing as it would do to you. It makes us into different people. But in some ways, maybe it makes us better people. I'm not sure. Like in some other professions that deal with difficult things, we try to learn to protect ourselves emotionally. I'm sure that, for instance, the medical profession has to do the same thing. And there are probably other people, perhaps a therapist who has to listen to people pour out their troubles every day, perhaps has to do the same thing. But we tried to learn how to get into a difficult situation and deal with it, and we cared about it intensely as we were there, but then we tried to kind of protect ourselves emotionally as we stepped away. And many, many times I did life-saving rescue type activities, CPR and so forth, on people. And when it was done and we put them in an ambulance and sent them off, I never learned whether they lived or died, because that was actually me, part of me protecting myself. And sometimes it can spin out of control anyway. Some of the people I worked with probably drank more than they should have. Some became pretty severely alcoholic. I remember a couple times when I saw people break down. We did a murder trial on a young woman who had been murdered brutally, and when it was done, the perpetrator was convicted and we met with the family after court, and it was the county attorney, prosecutor, and I and another officer. And after we were done meeting with the victim's family and they left, suddenly, to our surprise and astonishment, the prosecutor just sat down at his desk and just started to sob because he was so emotionally touched by what this family had gone through. And I saw a sheriff do the same thing in another similar situation, where even though he was an experienced person who dealt with a lot of bad things, he was just so overwhelmed by the tragedy at hand that he just cried for about 3 or 4 minutes in my office. So let me tell you a little bit about working homicides. I have kind of a little private remembrance time of the first homicide that I ever worked. 1986, and it was down in the Twin Cities. It was a 17-year-old girl who had only made the mistake of opening a door to the wrong guy. That's the only thing she did wrong. And she was brutally, brutally murdered. About 3 o'clock in the morning, I had the experience of bending down and looking into her face, and I thought, the only thing I can do for this poor kid is to catch the guy that did this. And we worked almost around the clock for 5 days, and we did catch him. But it was at that experience that helped me really see what my role was. My role was to be a voice for somebody who no longer had a voice, and to seek justice for somebody who couldn't seek justice for themselves anymore. And Of course, some homicides seem more tragic than others. Some are, one bad guy doing something to another bad guy. And if a person had kind of played a part in his own demise, you probably don't have to work quite so hard to stifle your grief. But there are a lot of really, really tragic ones that just tear on your heartstrings. The stakes are very high, and you really want to get it right. And one of the things that I found, I dealt with a lot of families of victims, but I also dealt sometimes with families of the perpetrator, the person that did the murder. And you know what I found? What those families go through makes them almost interchangeable, because we don't raise our children to be murderers. And when something like that happens within a family, whether your child is the victim or the murderer, it's a terrible thing to experience. And it's a terrible emotional thing. And of course, one of the big differences, everybody supports the family of the victim, and everybody hates the family, so to speak, of the perpetrator. And it's such a private thing to talk about what the families go through that in my book I did not write about very many homicide cases. I wrote about a couple of major abduction cases, Julie Holmquist and Katie Poyer, and I wrote about the shootout at the Turtle Club up north of town here. And the reason I felt I could write about them is because they received so much publicity at the time that I thought there's almost nothing I could say that hadn't already been said. But otherwise, I wouldn't have felt good about telling private inside details about a lot of the people whose homicides I investigated. There have been 3 things that have happened in the modern era that have really brought the science of homicide investigation a long ways forward. One of them is what's happened with fingerprints. You may know that fingerprint science has been around for quite a while. It was about 1890 when it dawned on somebody that we all had unique fingerprints, and if you were able to examine the minutiae, you could tell if it was your print or my print. But in this era, there are techniques for developing and locating fingerprints that are way, way more advanced. Somebody, I think by accident, discovered that cyanoacrylate fumes, in other words, superglue fumes, will actually develop fingerprints. And so that's one of the technologies now. They use lasers to read and identify and expose fingerprints. Number 2 development is DNA technology. And the BCA used DNA in its first homicide case in 1986. And that's a case that remained unsolved until about 6 months ago. And I'll tell you more about that in just a minute. The third thing that has really come along that's put this all together is computer databases. Because it used to be that if you had a partial fingerprint, but you didn't know who the suspect was, so you didn't have a fingerprint card you could look at, there wasn't much you could do about it. But nowadays, if you have a partial fingerprint, you can put it into a computer and it will search nationwide, if not worldwide. I'm not sure about that. And if that print is in the system anywhere, it'll find that and it'll tell you who it belongs to. Just marvelous technology. So when we first started using DNA, we needed a pretty good sized sample. They told us you needed a blood stain or whatever it is about the size of a dime or bigger in order to be able to get readable DNA out of it. Now they get readable DNA out of a cell or two. In other words, a tiny, tiny microscopic sample. and then they cloned it. I have no idea how they do that, but there's some very smart people at the BCA that do that every day. And so what that means is they now can get DNA. Let's say you're chewing gum and you spit it out. They'll get DNA from that. You smoke a cigarette and throw it down. They'll get DNA from that. You'll get DNA from the sweatband of your hat, or from your shoes, or from your toothbrush. So in the case that happened in 1986, it was a woman over on the Iron Range in Chisholm who was murdered in her home, raped and murdered. They had a good DNA sample, but they couldn't find who the suspect was. They had some people they thought were good suspects, and the DNA, in this case, very fortunately exonerated them, because DNA has done as much to exonerate people as it is to convict people. And so we kept trying, and I think before we were done, we had DNA samples from about half the men in Chisholm, and we still couldn't match it up. About a couple of years ago, I would say, I read an article in the paper about how some departments were now using public DNA databases to find familial groups that they then could search further and see if they could find a match. So I called the woman who was in the job I used to have here, and she had not been on the job long enough that she'd ever even heard of this case. And I said, there's a case over in Chisholm that's just waiting to be solved. And so I think that this would be an obvious one to do this with. So she began the wheels in motion, and they ultimately did identify a family group that this DNA came from. They began to do the detective work, and of course this is DNA from semen, so you threw out all the females in the family to start with, and then you do the basic detective work of this person lived on the West Coast and they've never been here, so they couldn't be a suspect. They got it down to somebody who looked like he was a good possibility. They did a little surveillance on him until he tossed something away that they could get a DNA sample from. They got a match. And it turned out that he had been at the time of the murder a teenage acquaintance of the victim's daughter, somebody that they had never even dreamed of as a possibility for a suspect. And so about, I'd say 6 months ago, they arrested him. And of course, it's still all waiting to be litigated. Let me just say just a couple things about the whole defund the police movement, and then I'd be happy to entertain any questions anybody has. One of the things that works with the way that things go right now is that you have people in cars with radios driving around who have communication with people who take emergency calls on the telephone, and in 30 seconds or a minute or 2 minutes, that person who's driving around can be at whatever the situation is where help is needed. And when that person, that police officer gets there, they have the entire array of possibilities that they can help with. You know, they don't go there thinking, well, we're on our way to shoot somebody if at all possible. That's not the mindset. The mindset is we're going to deal with whatever we were told is the problem. You know, a husband is beating his wife, or, you know, whatever the problem might be. But they have the whole array of possibilities of what they may be able to do to help. And of course, if it turns into a violent situation and the violence escalates, it could, of course, end up being deadly force situation. But that almost never happens. It almost always is resolved in another way. So when the defund the police vote was taken down in Minneapolis a week ago or so, it was voted down. And the people who were proposing that, to my knowledge anyway, never proposed an alternative plan. They just thought, we got to get rid of the cops. And as I wrote about that in the last chapter of my book, I just sort of wrote down a list of some of the things that I had done in my career as a police officer. And my basic question is, who's going to do the stuff? Who's going to do all this stuff if you don't have cops? And if the idea of a social worker going out appeals to you, well, there were a lot of times when I could have used a social worker, but I wouldn't want them to be the first one there to find out whether there's bullets flying or not. There are many times when police chaplains had not really come into existence yet when I was a uniformed cop, but I would love to have had a police chaplain or somebody like that come and help the people who needed help once we had settled what the issue was and once we had dealt with any possible violent situations. So, is there any possible tuning up you could do with the whole police system? I don't know. I'm sure all cops would be willing to listen to reason, but we'd just like to know what's the plan anyway before you say we don't need cops anymore. I know there's a few times in my life when I wasn't working that I was still pretty glad to see a cop show up. Let me throw out two possibilities. One is you can ask any questions you'd like to ask, or the other is I could read you one short story that's not in the book that I think it's kind of a humorous one now. I didn't think it was humorous at the time. Anybody got any questions? Yes, Judy.
In 1965, when you went into that great big auditorium to be signed up, what was your education prior to that? Had you finished high school?
Yes, I was almost done with my fourth year of college. But in those days, you didn't need to have a law enforcement degree as you do now. But yeah, I went to Itasca Junior College, as it was called then, over in Coleraine, and then I went to the University of Minnesota. Let me read this to you quick, then we'll see what happens. This is called I Learn About Seatbelts. And you have to, I have to make sure that you have this in your mind. If you've flown lately, you know that airplane seatbelts are still like the old-fashioned seatbelts, right? They're a clasp that you open and it unclasps. Well, that's the way car seatbelts were back in the 1960s. And so here's the story. It was a Sunday afternoon and I had just come on duty working the 802 car, which operated in the north central part of the city. The district took in some residential neighborhoods as well as some business and manufacturing areas. We'd just taken delivery of some brand new squad cars, and I was pleased to buckle myself into one of these for the first time. We ran our squads way over 100,000 miles before replacing them, and they were pretty bedraggled and used up by the time we said goodbye to them. A new car was a treat. I just hit the street when I got a burglary in progress call at a manufacturing plant in the area. Most commercial burglaries happen at night, but the backside of a business can be a pretty private place on a Sunday afternoon, so I took the call seriously. In stealth mode, I cruised into the lot and around the side of the building. As I rounded the corner, there they were on the loading dock, two guys prying at the back door. I loved catching burglars. The danger level was high, adrenaline flowed freely, and an arrest like this was recognized with some envy by other cops as a good pinch. Every such event became part of the department folklore. I knew these startled burglars were mine as I slid to a stop, grabbed my shotgun, and prepared to bail out. It was at this point that the story changed from one that I would later modestly share with an adoring public. It became instead an account that I would keep to myself, only replaying it in my mind as one always does with an embarrassing incident. In moments of excitement, when adrenaline is doing its useful work, we depend on muscle memory to take care of some of the detail work. As I had done many times before, I grabbed the seatbelt buckle to unclasp it. Only after several swipes with my hand did I realize that something was dreadfully wrong. There was no clasp with which to open the buckle, as there had been in every squad car I had previously driven. There was no visible way to unfasten the buckle. Imagine the surge of conflicting emotions the burglars were experiencing. First, they realized they were cornered and were, to use a technical term common with cops and miscreants, busted. Then, as they stood there with their hands up, they noticed that the guy in the cop car, contrary to established protocol, was not leaping out of the squad and telling them to freeze. In fact, he was not getting out at all, but seemed to be writhing around in the car, which rocked with the violence of his activity. Despair became hope, then jubilation as they leaped off the loading dock, sprung over the fence, and ran off. I feel that I may bear some small responsibility for my failure in this situation, but the largest part goes to some unknown engineer at Ford who came up with a clever idea of making the Ford emblem at the center of the buckle the release mechanism. Push the brand name and the buckle opens every time. In succeeding days, I executed this maneuver countless times with no problems. I could do it with either hand. I could do it with my eyes closed. I met more than one person who could do it while intoxicated. But having not yet unlocked the secret of the seatbelt, with a pair of burglars going over the horizon, I couldn't do it at all. My report to the dispatcher and other responding cars was an edited version of this account. 802 dispatch, there were two guys at the back door. They went over the fence and are running south. We never caught them. I never told that story to any of the Bloomington cops, and if they read the book, they won't find it in there either. But I have a website, terrysmithauthor.com, and I'm posting stories in there that didn't make it into the book. And so there are 3 posted right now. There's another one about working protection details. I worked a few of them. I worked a protection detail with when Gorbachev came to town. I protected Jahan Sadat, the widow of the president of Egypt who was assassinated. I worked a protection detail with the Russian ski team when they were here for the World Cup races. And I wanted to work the protection detail with Olivia Newton-John when she was here, but unfortunately a couple senior guys snapped that one up and left me wishing. So, anybody have any questions or comments?
Yeah, this goes back to your time in Bloomington. We were residents there at that time,
Really?
and there was an armored car robbery at the Target store in Bloomington.
Remember
that
it well.
Resulted in one death, but I've never heard if that case ever got solved.
It did get solved. That happened after I had left there. I was working for the BCA. I can almost think of the detective that worked that case, but I can't quite remember which one it was. But yeah, that was a really bad deal because the guy that shot the guard didn't need to shoot him. He just walked up out of hand and just killed him when he could have just robbed him. But yeah, that was a really, really big case. Went on for quite a while before they solved it, but they did solve it.
Okay.
So where did you live in Bloomington?
Well, we were in, at that time, over in the west side of town, rented a house for a couple of years in Normandale, bought a house down near Southwood School, and then by the time you had left Bloomington, we bought another home up on Colorado Road.
And when I was working there, that whole west side, you felt more like a game warden working out there than a police officer. But now it's all built up, and I wouldn't even be able to find my way around there.
Right.
We lived at 110th and Washburn.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I taught there for 31 years.
Did you?
Yeah.
At which school?
Well, we had one high school when I came in '61, and then expanded to 3 high schools.
Let's see, was that Lincoln?
Well, it became Lincoln. At that time,
Yeah.
it was just Bloomington High School.
Okay.
Yeah, I taught there, and Kennedy, were in schools. No? Thank you for telling me that, because I never heard how that case turned out.
Yeah. Okay, well, yes.
When you were with the BCA up here, it seemed like your territory ran all the way from Duluth-ish to North Dakota.
The whole top half of the state.
How far south did you cover?
We got down to around Little Falls in that area. If you imagine a line across what would be the midsection of belt of Minnesota,
Okay.
we were everything north.
Okay, so things that happened in the Brainerd Lakes area, you would be
They were
familiar
ours.
with. Okay.
Right. And way, way more death investigations than I would have ever thought there would be.
Yeah.
And we also, at that time, the BCA provided most SWAT team help for the northern half of the state. Now most counties have their own SWAT, but in those days it was pretty much us. And so we would get a call, something bad is happening, and everybody's pager would go off, and we'd all go rushing there and deal with whatever had to be dealt with. And I did write a story about that, and one of the really difficult ones we had was up in Roseau County. I mentioned in the book where it was 36 below when we started out, and we had a barricaded suspect shooting out the windows at everybody. And normally the tactic is to wait him out, but when it's 36 below and you're outside, waiting him out doesn't seem like very much of an option. And so I told the guys, we're just going to go in and tear gas this guy out. And we're using liquid tear gas, and by the time we got in there in position, I'm sure that our liquid tear gas had frozen into tear gas popsicles, but it still worked. And we filled the house with gas, and the guy gave up and came out, so that's good. You know, you use a lot of things that seem violent, but the object of what seems violent is usually to keep from hurting people. We would much rather scare a person into throwing their gun down and giving up than not scare them quite so badly and end up having to shoot him. I never knew a cop who didn't hate the thought of shooting somebody. And what we all know is that if you ever do, it's probably the end of your career. Almost all, one of the responsibilities of the BCA is to investigate all officer-involved shootings. And so I was in charge of many of those investigations and sat down with the cop who had done the shooting, and they all, to a person, realized that their life as they had known it was over. Most of them ended up leaving the business, and it's gotten probably more serious instead of less serious as time has gone on. So, you all need to go home. Yes, okay.
Are there any unsolved ones that bother you?
They all bother me.
Yeah. Any that you'd care to share that we might know of?
I know what you're driving at. Yeah, I think you're talking about the Anita Carlson case. I was in charge of that case for the BCA. You know, technically the case belongs to Beltrami County, but the BCA was sort of the major investigative group. And it's an unsolved case, and I must not talk about details about the case. I will tell you that we lay awake at night and think about these things. When you go to a scene and you see a tragic victim, you never forget what you saw there. You never forget what you felt emotionally as you could see what had happened to that person. And I still wake up at night and think about Anita Carlson. I used to go and visit her family every year, only to let them know that we still cared. You know, I didn't have any news for them other than we're still working on it, or maybe we have a lead here or something like that. Her parents are dead now, and I know that when Phil Hodap took over as sheriff, he used to work for me at the BCA, and he used to go and see them as well after I was retired. But it would be improper for me to talk details about that case. I would say that, you know, rumors always float up and down Beltrami County or Beltrami Avenue about who did it. And I always told the people working for me, I don't ever want to hear you say, I know who did it, but I can't prove it. Because my point was, if you can't prove it, you don't know who did it. And so I have never speculated to anybody telling them, yeah, I know, we just don't have the proof. I'd love to see that case solved. And the one I mentioned over in Chisholm was an older case than Anita Carlson, and that was solved. So you always hope, but I will give no guarantees. Yes?
Could you explain the title of your book?
Oh, yeah. I should have done that right away. I read a couple books about self-publishing, and one of the things that it said is the title of a nonfiction book should always tell people what the book is about. So I really screwed up when I titled this book. Code 4 is what the cops say when they've gone to a dangerous situation and it's under control. They get on with the dispatcher and they say, we're Code 4. And that basically means you don't have to worry about us, you don't have to send us any more help, we've got this handled, we'll be done soon. And so I suppose what the meaning of the title for me is, well, I made it through a 37-year career. I held who knows how many people at gunpoint and never had to shoot anybody. I had a guy shoot at me once and he missed, and many times was in situations where I could have lost my life but didn't. So Code 4 to me means I made it through. But thinking of a title for a book is really hard. I mean, I sat around brainstorming for many nights. I'd sit there for 2 or 3 hours and, you know, write down every title I could think of. I had pages of titles and they all stunk. Or you think of something you thought was a pretty good title, and then you go look on Amazon and see that 14 other people thought that was a good title too. So it is what it is. but that's what Code 4 means, and I'll never write another book, so this is the best I can do. Yes, sir.
Your thoughts about your BCA days in the work with the reservation law enforcement in your whole catchment area. So with the current push to have the law enforcement of the FBI, BCA, and on the reservation and so on, is for the working harder together towards solving the missing indigenous females, mostly females, and so on, where it seems like in the past it hasn't been a priority, and now it is, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So your thoughts, now that you're over with your career, going forward, how do you see that changing for the better, or not?
I don't know if much will change from the BCA standpoint, because we didn't have jurisdiction on Red Lake, and that's Red Lake's choice. That was not the BCA's choice. They choose to be a sovereign nation. They choose to have their own law enforcement, and so we did get up there from time to time to assist with crime scenes and so forth, but we always went as invited guests. And of course, when we did go, we had no law enforcement authority, which puts you in kind of a vulnerable place. It's to take a shot at you or something, and you have no authority, and it's really complicated. The FBI does have authority there, and there were some great FBI agents stationed here when I was working. I don't know the ones who are here now, but Joe Ryan and Dick Nelson and John Egelhoff.
Bill McLean?
Pardon?
Bill McLean?
He was before my time here,
Before
I
your
think.
time, okay.
Yeah, but we've all read about the missing Indigenous women, and my heart goes out to that situation. Sometimes minority people think that we don't care as much about them as we do about other people. But boy, that was never true of me. You could tear my heart out, whether you were a native person or a black person or whatever race you might be. If something bad had happened to you, I cared. And there are a lot of cops that are that way. But I don't know what the solution to that is. Yes, sir.
Did you have anything to do with the school shooting there then?
I was retired. But the BCA did respond to that. I think one of the realistic things is that the BCA and the BCA lab are the best crime scene processors that I have ever dealt with. And I've been to many murder scenes, but I don't want to be the one who's there collecting evidence. I want somebody who does that for a living. And so that's also true of the FBI. In the big cities, they have squads of people who do evidence and so forth. But the FBI agents who were up here, at least when I was working, were great people, great investigators, but you didn't necessarily want to send them out to lift a fingerprint. And so they had this kind of a working relationship with the BCA lab, that when they needed that kind of help, that's where they turned for it.
So how many lab people were here that actually would do the actual?
The processing,
Yeah.
all the lab people that are here are cross-trained in all the disciplines for collecting evidence. And I think there probably were, let's say, 15 people in the lab at that time. And you may have seen, on TV when there's a crime scene, you may have seen the big lab truck. It's like a rolling billboard for the BCA. It's got BCA in about 4-foot high letters on it. And that's always manned by a group of scientists and also expert videographers and boy, do they do a nice job. You know, at every homicide scene, there is a finite number of pieces of evidence, and I never wanted to lose one of them. And you're more likely to achieve that end with that group than with any other group. Certainly more likely than if you sent me out to lift fingerprints.
Do the records, like the photographs and the actual evidence, stay here?
Do they stay here? They keep records here, and as I understand it, it's all electronic now. You know, it used to be all paper, but I don't think they even use paper anymore. But then, of course, duplicate files go to prosecutors and probably down to St. Paul where headquarters is. I'm not sure about that. But, and I just was talking to the director of the lab here about a week ago, and he told me that they're now in the works to double the size of the BCA office out here. So unfortunately, business is good. Yes?
I wondered if you were involved in a homicide case outside of Crosby, Minnesota in the spring of '95.
You remember a name?
Michael Lee Sargent, David Doppler. Sargent was the victim. Doppler was convicted, if I'm remembering correctly.
I must have been.
Okay. The body was found right near a public access to a little Blackcliff Lake just west.
Was he killed with a fish whacker?
No, he was killed with a revolver.
You know, it's almost hard to understand. If one of these events that I was involved in had happened to me, it would have been the highlight of my life. But when you work about 450 death investigations, after a while, it sounds crazy, but you almost can't even remember some of them.
Sure.
It seems astonishing that I could say, yeah, I probably stood there and looked at that body, but I don't remember it. But that's kind of the way it works. Sometimes I need something to call it back to my attention, but I don't remember those names and I don't remember the circumstance.
Okay, then you probably did not talk to me about it after I found the body.
No, I probably did not. And you got to remember that I was the supervisor.
Sure.
So normally what happened is I would send whatever number of agents I needed to send to investigate. And if it sounded complicated, or frankly, if it sounded interesting,
Yeah.
then I would go myself. But I didn't go to every scene, and you know, talking to witnesses and so forth would be done by the investigators.
Okay.
Now you're all kind of trapped in the room here, so if anybody really wishes they were someplace else, I will not be offended if you get up and leave. On the other hand, if anybody has any more questions, I'd be happy to answer them. But I'll give you my exalted, authoritative permission to get up and leave if you want to. So this is the book. If you're interested in it, they've got them for sale out here. I'd be happy to sign it for you, or if you have a book that you purchased, you can also later on. Of course, my big pitch is these make great Christmas presents, and you know from the news that you're not going to be able to get Christmas presents from anybody else. So you can get them not only here, but you can get them at McKinsey Place and Four Pines Books and the Hospital Gift Shop and Bemidji Woolens. So there you go.
Thank you.
You're welcome.